Okay, hi everyone. I'm Laura Mark, and I kind of set up this virtual unit 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago now, kind of as a response to, I was teaching at the time and all my teaching had kind of been cancelled and fallen through because there was this sudden kind of universities are closed. And I felt like there's a lot of kind of conversations that just happen in studios and around the classroom that were then kind of couldn't happen. And I wanted to kind of find a way to create a forum for discussion, and to bring different schools together. So for those of you who've been to these before, we've had like kind of students from all around the world come, and it's a really good chance to kind of chat and talk to each other. So I kind of want you to all like see it as a dialogue as well, of talking and responding to each other. And it's a kind of open forum, so feel free to kind of contribute as much or as little as you want. I've tended to, the first one we did was really general, with lots of discussion about, ended up being quite, a lot of discussion about like the future of education in a time of kind of change. But this one has a particular focus on kind of alternative modes of practice and kind of coming into practice at a time of recession or crisis, and what that means for kind of students and kind of young practitioners. It was kind of a request that we'd had from quite a few people, students asking, could we do something that was more focused on careers? So that's what this one is. I'll just say a little bit about how this kind of will work. So I invite kind of 4 practitioners or architects or academics and their cats to come along and kind of give a kind of little introduction about them and their work, but also to form part of that discussion. They're kind of picked for their relevance or how I think they kind of are relevant to the discussion. And so they will kind of lead, alongside me, they'll lead the talk, but you're kind of all free to contribute. So if you want to ask a question or make a comment, then there's a little button. If you click on the kind of manage participants, there's a button that says like raise hands, which comes up in the sidebar if it's in the same as your screen. And if you click that, then I'll try and field the questions. Also, if you're kind of don't want to have to say it in front of everyone or whatever, you can also just type it in the chat, and I'll kind of at various points try and pick those out. So we're going to get started. So I'm going to let the speakers kind of introduce themselves. So Julia, do you want to go first?
Thanks. So thanks, Laura. I think it's a really great initiative and I'm really happy to be part of it. For those of you, I mean, and I don't see why you'd necessarily know me, but I graduated in 2007. So I guess I'm of that breed who came about into practice during a really difficult time for architecture, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be a really difficult time going forward. And I went and worked for an engineering firm just because I wanted to. It wasn't out of I thought it would be a really interesting job. But at some point, about 3 years into being an architect within an engineering firm, I sort of was like, this isn't, I'm from Venezuela. I grew up in India, and I chose to study architecture because maybe I should have been an urbanist. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have studied architecture, but I was really interested in the sort of social and kind of like political and cultural implications of design. And I just felt that in practice, it wasn't quite happening for me. But I equally felt that I didn't know how to sort of change my career. I kind of didn't know. I knew that mainstream architectural practice wasn't for me, but I didn't really know how to shift it. And actually just kind of serendipitous, I sent out a lot of emails during this period. And I was actually trying to get a teaching job because I thought that that could fund an alternative kind of career. And luckily in this process, I managed to get myself a PhD scholarship, something I never intended on doing. And I embarked on doing what is called a PhD by practice. And so this allowed me to have, I had about 3 years of funded time, which ended up being 4. 4th year is not fun. And it was a way to develop a kind of, within an intellectual rigor and an academic kind of context, I went back to India and I started working in sort of peripheral, very poor settlements in Delhi. And very long story, which is about an hour-long talk in itself. By the end of my PhD by practice, I had written a PhD, but I had also designed and developed various sort of sanitation projects in India, and actually had delivered on 8 basic infrastructure projects. And this was kind of, and so now I think I'm not an architect. I'm not a Part 3 architect, and I kind of sometimes dabble in architecture in the sense that I draw, and I'm often propositional in my academic work. But cutting to today, and again, it's a sort of another long story. I'm at the London School of Economics full time. I research within LSE Cities, so I'm a research fellow there, and I also teach on the Cities program, which is a multidisciplinary course, and I also teach at Central St Martin's, and the work that I'm currently doing now, which is very much framed by the kind of practice that I sort of started in my PhD, was very much working with the most marginalized people in the context of India, and thinking about how you can, co-design. I don't necessarily like using that word, but let's just use it. How you can co-design basic infrastructure. And in the London context, so recently I've been working with a group of young adults from Brent, and we've been designing public space. I also do a lot of policy work, sort of looking at affordable sanitation in the context of Addis Ababa. Now I'm doing a comparative study of Pakistan and Addis Ababa. So that architectural knowledge has been really useful for me to craft a career in academia, where I can talk about the sort of spatial implications of policies, whether that be housing, urban planning, sanitation infrastructure. I've done a fair amount of work on high streets. Yeah, I've dabbled. That's a sort of, I think, an intro.
Thanks, Julia. So yeah, I guess I should say why I chose Julia to join us, but it was mainly because we met years ago when Julia was shortlisted and then won the Young kind of Women in Architecture Award that I was kind of working on at the time. And I was just really interested then in the kind of different work that you were doing, and kind of how a kind of architectural background could lead you to do different work. And in terms of this discussion, I think that's what's really interesting. So yeah, so Zoe, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I think Julia's done a really beautiful introduction there, which I might kind of match the sort of the way in which, perhaps chronologically, I might talk about the work that I've done. And so I decided, kind of going right back, I decided that I wanted to study architecture because I was at school. In my sixth form, I was studying art and design and philosophy, and I had really, really enjoyed doing history, and I was enjoying, I was also kind of doing a lot of arts-based dance and various things, and I was writing a lot. And I very much felt that I wanted to study something that would enable me to continue to both think about things from the kind of the philosophy side, thinking about things in around kind of sociology and around people, but also to be being creative as well. And I felt that if I was to go down just kind of a fine art course or just a philosophy and history course, that would maybe shut off one thing or the other. And I remember I was doing a lot of furniture design at the time, and absolutely loving being in the workshop with a group of friends, and we formed this really, really strong group who we were kind of waiting at the door of the workshop every morning, like, let us in, and this lovely communality was developing in that workshop space. And I remember one day I'd been reading a lot about design, and I'd been doing some writing, and I remember I just thought, I think I want to study architecture, because I think this is going to be the course that will enable me to continue to be thinking about people and place and philosophy and social issues, and also to be thinking creatively as well. And I knew right from the get-go that I didn't want to do what I would describe as architecture with a capital A. The kind of walls and windows and doors, that wasn't for me. And I think that there's kind of people who are infinitely better than I am at doing that. I wanted to develop a kind of opportunities that would enable me to hold you know, those kind of multiple interests. I absolutely stand by that decision of undertaking a study in architecture that kind of enabled me to do that. I'm really interested hearing Julia saying that you worked in an engineer, that you spent some time with engineers, because then when I went on my part 1 year out, when I was a kid, I really struggled with dyslexia desperately, and when other people, like when I was 7 years old, I could neither read nor write, and other people were, you know, sailing along, and people were saying to my parents, oh, you know, Zoe will get there, you know, she's just kind of a bit of a slow learner, and I was really incredibly lucky that a new teacher came in when I was 7 and was like, no, Zoe needs some extra help and needs kind of additional support. And that meant that I went off and had kind of like extra lessons and things, which was really tough and really difficult. But it meant that my maths, I always really struggled with maths. And so I'd always thought like, and the sort of the engineering, the kind of the calc side of things is something that I can't do. Like that's not me. I don't have maths. And then I remember when I was doing some work experience, when I was a student, that I was in a meeting where there was this design team, and more happened in that conversation between the architects, the various engineers from different disciplines, than possibly had been achieved for like months of pushing emails backwards and forwards. And suddenly I was seeing engineers sketching and the architects talking to them, and I was like, I get this, like I get these principles, I understand this, and I wanted to spend more time doing that. So I then spent some time working for Bureau Happold Engineers when I was on my year out, and that was right. I think I kind of have a foot in both camps of having a peak and a trough, because I started my year out when there was lots of work, and then in the first year I was working with Bureau Happold, and then the crash of 2008 hit, and then I started kind of working part-time and freelance and things, and carried on into, and actually Julia was a couple of years ahead of me at the CAS at London Met School of Architecture, where I was then evolving more of an interest and developing a kind of an interest in making and cross-disciplinary work and collaboration. And then I suppose coming up to just kind of bring things up to date to right now, I am a director of a small design group, and it works in a collaborative way, that it's kind of a network of people who come together to work on a project by project basis. I'm really interested, I also teach, and I'm really interested in education and making and research, and how those two things inform one another. And I've met Laura through the Studio in the Woods project, which I find immensely interesting and constructive. And then also to kind of with my sort of social and equity and equality hat on, I also in 2018 I founded a group called Part W, which is a campaign group that it's an action group that campaigns for gender equity across the built environment. So I'm kind of very involved, or increasingly involved in exploring ideas around how we design and realise places and spaces in a way that is equal for all, and open to everybody. So that's me.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I guess the reason for inviting Zoe was for this kind of look at like collaborative kind of practice and working in a kind of group, almost like a group of like individuals but that come together for kind of different projects. Yeah, I feel like everyone I've chosen has like graduated at the same time into the kind of recession of 2008. But Eddie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Eddie Blake. Yeah, I guess I'm the token man on your panel, Laura, thanks. I'm the odd one out because I graduated a year later in 2009, but it was still absolute like hellish landscape for a young part two. And my way around this problem is I moved to Germany, where there was still lots of jobs and they were still building a lot, which is like a slightly romanticized story, because actually I wanted to do that anyway because I thought that'd be interesting. I worked for Sabrick Hutton, which is kind of a large commercial practice, but one who still does kind of interesting architecture, or at least like nice architecture maybe. And then I came back to London for a girl, and I'm still here, and she's the mother of my child. And I worked for a practice called Studio Weave that was, I think it was quite like archetypical for a mode of very like proactive, young, like not quite job creating, but like hungry practices of that moment. We got a lot of work from the OLF, the Outer London Fund, like for years, that practice was funded by local authorities, which was like this other model, which is kind of polar opposite from getting your rich uncle to fund an extension, like get like Croydon Council to allow you to do a bit of public realm. So a lot of public realm, and that's what I worked on for quite a few years. And then, and actually all this time I've been doing a little bit of teaching, and like the kind of dream of practice informing your teaching, teaching informing your practice, I still like hold on to with like these little stubby fingers. And it's so weird constantly having a picture of yourself while you're talking to a massive audience. Like I'm looking at you guys, but also I can see myself just anyway. Yeah, and then I moved to Sam Jacobs Studio, which I still work for in a kind of freelance way. We're doing a building together, but I teach the RCA and I write like as much as I can in the non-architectural press about architecture in a kind of wider sense. And I suppose this is a mode of practice, like as in writing as a kind of form of developing ideas, architectural ideas through different means, like apart from drawing or making. But so yeah, now I have this like very mixed career, and my rule is basically I try and only do things that I'm really interested in. That's how I try to like shape it. Obviously you got to pay the bills, but as much as possible, I think it's much easier to earn money when you like really interested in the thing that you're doing. Yeah, I hope that's enough of chronology. I don't want to go too far back. It gets very much.
Yeah, that's great, Eddie. I think for me, what's interesting about you is that kind of progression through quite interesting different practices, and then kind of moving to like doing it on your own, I guess, as well.
Yeah, although like for years, I've been very concerned about not aiming for like doing it by yourself as the final destination of being an architect. I think it's a real like disease, ego-led disease of architects, that they think having their own practice is the best model. I was really interested in what Zoe was saying about having this kind of like networked practice where like people just come together project by project. That seems quite natural. But yeah, like, you know, my ego's big enough already. I don't need to put my name above the door to fulfill some dream. And I'm basically trying to avoid that. But it feels like also a lot of the mechanisms of our industry support that model of practice, as in like the name above the door. It's really useful to have that kind of recognition. It's really useful to have the support structures, the infrastructure of having a practice with a specific name, in order to get work, in order to get attention.
Yeah, definitely. So now we've kind of had an introduction from all of our speakers, I'm gonna kind of kick it off with a few questions, but if you've got any in particular that you want to kind of begin to raise, just start to kind of put your hands up or jot them down in the chat and I'll come to them. So my first kind of question is really for all of you, but it's basically if you know, you all graduated in 2000, kind of between 2007 and 2009, which was a pretty tricky time to graduate in architecture, and I think there's probably going to be some parallels with the kind of economic and job situation of then and kind of what is coming up now. And I wondered whether you have any advice that you would give to your younger self graduating at that time. Kind of looking back. Who wants to go first? Zoe?
Yeah, so I guess I kind of I'm on a like fractionally different. I guess my experience of the kind of the timescale was fractionally different because I graduated a couple of years later, so I graduated in 2011, and I think I just had the luck that I was going back into education just as things were really starting to shift and to downturn. Like I had a year of clearly things were starting to drop off, and then I was able to like almost hide back in my diploma for 2 years, which I think actually for those people who are in education right now, it can be a really good place to be able to then look outwards and see what's going on, and to have those couple of years to observe and to learn from what's going on out there. I think education can be an incredibly good platform, obviously, to be able to be taught by practitioners who are dealing with things, and then also to be learning and absorbing what's going on and sort of readying oneself, and giving thought to being flexible. But I think that one of the things that you said, what advice would I give myself? I think I'd probably be grateful for the fact that I was thinking in quite a kind of a nimble and part-time flexible way. That was always my interest. I think the piece of advice that I would really give myself is to be confident in that, because I think very much picking up on something that Eddie was just a kind of a continuation perhaps of what Eddie was just saying about this idea of like the sort of the figureheads within architecture, which I think really often kind of dominates press and press so much. I think the architectural press, I think, so much defines how we consider notions of value and notions of success and what success looks like. And what success looks like is actually something that in part W that we talk about a lot in terms of kind of visibility and recognition, and who gets recognised, and obviously in terms of when we're thinking about diversity and equity. That for decades that has been quite unbalanced, but I think I would want to try and give my younger self more confidence in flexibility being a good thing rather than being a kind of like a secondary or like even a cop-out option, and that actually that to build your multiple, to accept and build on your multiple interests, and the diversity of your interests is a strength rather than a weakness. I think there's a big push towards this, this kind of traditional models of architecture as that being what's held up as like being the way, and anything else is a bit secondary or kind of almost a bit weak. And so I think I'd sort of say to my younger self, like, no, it's a really good thing. And actually in like what I've now found is that a lot of the practices that I really admire now tend to be working in a multiple kind of way, in a community-led way. I really love like the kind of work of like, for example, the decorators, a practice space, they kind of describe themselves as being about spatial design. They are made up with someone who studied landscape architecture, someone from interior design, and someone who studied psychology. Amazing, like what a fantastic kind of rich group of people. And so I think I would try to give my younger self confidence in that sort of multiplicity and variation.
It's really useful though, if you have that attitude, that you can also call yourself an architect, which is such a big umbrella term. Like even Julia, even though you don't have your part 3, you can be an architect too. It's okay, we won't tell you. And like it's a funny thing. It's a funny way that our profession has developed, that it's such a broad thing. It's like calling yourself a doctor, and like, what's that mean? Like you're a medical doctor, like you're a GP, you're like into ophthalmology or something. That like having these really broad terms is like useful for being fleet-footed and like doing the thing that you're interested in. I also wanted to echo maybe slightly nuance it about your point, Zoe, on like multiplicity, like following like lots of different paths. Like do the things that you're interested in, and like if you do them and you do them hard, and like you really like explore those ideas, then possibly they'll like something will come to fruition. Like not necessarily, like maybe you'll waste a bunch of time, like that happens, but also like as a general rule, if you kind of follow these things, like they will reward you. I
think to echo that, I think I had this question at a talk I did recently, and I gave an answer, and then I was going home and I was like, you know what, I need to learn from my younger self. I think I need to re-find the energy that I had when I was younger. The kind of, I was so not worried about failing, or I just did stuff all the time, and you know, as what Eddie was saying, not all of it came to fruition. I have so many projects that have been unfinished. I have a website that hasn't been touched in years. And in a way, I think what I really like, and what I'm trying to get back to now as a sort of as someone of age, is the kind of ignorance that I had at the time. That ignorance was just such a wonderful and creative place to be from. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about. We shouldn't think of ignorance in its pejorative sense, which is often how it's talked about. And that can actually be a very creative position from which to then look at the world and think about how one intervenes. And as a student, just as a kind of, you know, when you're younger, people give you time. You know, it's much harder for me now to say, oh, you know, Eddie, can I pick your brains on something? But whilst if I've got a sort of a 21-year-old, yeah, I'll give them my time. You know, people are incredibly generous, and I really benefited from that when I was 27 years old and designing a sewage system with no knowledge whatsoever about any of that. And yet I did it with the utmost confidence, not in a kind of white neoliberal the kind of archetype of the white neoliberal male. I did it with a kind of a sensitivity, but a commitment, naivety, and just an enjoyment. And so I just think, yeah, ask questions, reach out. And particularly now, I'm just having a private conversation with an ex-student of mine who's in the group, you know, and it's like, do reach out to people. You'll find a lot of generosity amongst us as a kind of abroad. And I can see people like Shumi here. I can see, you know, who else? Like, there's loads of people in this chat who are really generous with their time. So yeah, push forward.
I think honesty is a really, that note on honesty is a really nice point as well, Julia, which is something that I think perhaps I'd also say that we maybe need to reconnect with, but also continue through in a kind of continually within career. Like, I find that it's really lovely, because I still see myself as a relatively young practitioner within like the big industry. These kind of notions, you know, there's this sort of old phrasing which I loathe of you're no one within architecture until you're 40. And I would actually say that like, you know, traditionally, you know, this is someone who's kind of looked quite closely at the statistics of medals. You're nobody unless you're 60, you're white, and you're male. And I find that what I think is really a brilliant release, I find this still now as a practitioner, when one's just able to be honest and say, do you know what, I've never designed one of the, you know, I've never designed this before, or I've never kind of dealt with this particular issue. And as soon as you're kind of honest with people, with other collaborators, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, you know, like how can I help, and how can, you know, what do you need? And sort of, you know, I think like maybe, I think there's a real thing with it, you know, perhaps that kind of rolls into this conversation around the way in which like the architectural industry presents itself in terms of, you know, within media, within press, within social media, that there's this constant like comparing of like, you know, who's done what, and wow, they really look like they, you know, they know their shit, and they've kind of done loads of these projects. But actually it's so nice when you start to think that, you know, when you start to kind of remind yourself that actually every project is new, and every collaboration is new. You're always learning, and to be very open about that, and to be very honest and say, I don't know what I'm doing, and like that then actually releases people's, yes, when you're a student, when you're younger, and when you continue through, I think it kind of like releases people's ability to just like feel more relaxed and to chip in and to make suggestions, rather than like always having to present like, I totally know what I'm doing. And it's like, no, actually, like most of us don't, and that's fine. And actually that's where the kind of the not knowing is where creativity can really start to happen.
I think everyone is like faking it on those first projects anyway, aren't they? Like, yeah, I can do it, and you get it, and then you've got that panic of like, oh, what do I do now? Oh well, we can do it. And it, you know, it comes to like, there's examples from years ago of like future systems winning like competitions, and it was just 2 of them in the office, and they just like got people in to pretend they were part of it, to like make them look bigger and things like that.
Yes, yeah.
I've done that for so many people.
Yeah. Like everyone.
The fake staff.
But I do want to chip in, because I can see, and it's a thread in this conversation. Someone's made a comment about sort of the value of a prescribed route through education in this, and I just do want to reflect on that in this context. Is that, so when I came out and maybe had a sort of like early midlife crisis in my 20s, I was like, I'm not an architect. This is a useless profession. I really was on a downer about the whole thing. I was like, I'm a development practitioner, you know. And then all of a sudden I realized that no, actually, you get a series of quite useful skills as an architect. You're trained to kind of collaborate. You're trained to draw, which is a really phenomenally useful skill to have. And I think I often talk about it to my students, like, you as the architect, almost, we are one of the only professions that can actually say what is there, to then be able to provoke what could be there. You know, this is what is here. And that's what good architecture for me is, effectively something where an architect goes and they can be able to tell you what is there and then say, okay, actually, this is what it could be. Which isn't necessarily a brand new spanking building. Maybe it's, you know, a program or a piece of policy, or it is an extension. And when I've kind of reclaimed the architecture tag, it really helped me navigate this kind of muddiness of, you know, where my role was effectively in a slum in Delhi. And my role was not to be a social worker. My role was not to be a doctor, you know. My role was to draw and to hold hands with other people who had legitimacy in being in a slum, and to help change the terms of the debate of what it meant to be a slum dweller in that context. And that really, it really helped me to just kind of go, you're not a politician, you're not these things, but you can do these things. You can make it better. You can try and make a change here through a model, or, you know, a kind of creating a conversation by bringing people together. And that, I think, is really, I keep on having to remind myself of that.
Yeah, I think I would also like to just, we've got some other questions, but I would like to also just take a moment to respond to Andre's kind of question about if you're certain that you don't want to kind of do the prescribed detailing doors and windows and all of that kind of architecture stuff, is there a value in completing the kind of education process of an architect? And as I'll confess now, I kind of got a week away to doing my part 3 and then quit. And so I am prime example of someone who went all the way to that end point and then freaked out. And I really struggled for like many years thinking I was a complete failure, because the kind of whole system was set up to be like, you must qualify as an architect to have reached that point. And I couldn't call myself an architect. I quit because I got offered a job at the AJ, and I knew I didn't really want to be an architect. I was kind of really questioning that. And kind of even in my role at the AJ, I would kind of come up against people who'd be like, well, you're not an architect. You're not an architect. And I'd be like, well, I've been all the way through. I'm like a week away. Like, I kind of am. And it's still like this like challenge. But I think even if there's different, it depends on you as a person, you know, it depends on your kind of thought process and whether it's kind of actually what you want out of it is partly, you know, having gone through it all and to say you got there and you've done that, or whether it's like, well, I don't really need it anyway. Like, what am I going to get from that? I mean, there's plenty of people out there who you think, you know, who are running like top practices who never ever qualified and got to the end. Eddie and Zoe, do you want to add anything to those comments?
Yeah, well, I suppose maybe an important distinction to introduce to the conversation at this point is the split between the profession and the discipline. And we often confuse them, as like model them into the same thing, and they're quite different. Like the discipline of architecture is thousands of years old, and it's often expressed through drawing, but it's a culture, and it's something I'm really interested in. The profession of architecture is something quite different, and it's relatively new, like hundreds of years old, and it's tied up with legal definitions and contract law. And it's still, it's interesting in its own way, but it's not what architecture is. And like, the funny thing is, as an architect, you kind of embody both. Like, I am qualified, I'm registered, but I spend most of my time not engaging with that stuff. That's like that's the admission cost to taking part in the discipline, but it needn't be. And I suppose what I'm trying to say here in answer to Andre's question, like, yeah, I would like strongly recommend if you want to be an architect to take your part 3, but to engage in architecture, the discipline, you don't need to. And so I wouldn't worry about that. However, on the other side, I'd also say there's a so the last conversation I had on Zoom about half an hour ago was a long page by page, we call it a page turner meeting with the contractor for a new building that we're building. And sometimes, as a relatively young architect, I'm like concerned that I don't have the expertise, and I was very reassured by Zoe saying like, yeah, it's fine, like admit when you don't know things. And I think that's incredibly important, to acknowledge your ignorance, the areas of ignorance, but it's also quite important to bring the expertise and the education you do have to the table and be quite kind of protective over it, because other areas of the industry, like a third term, so you have the professional discipline industry, will push back at you, and they have their own agendas, like buildability or cost or some other policy reason for why they might want to shape this space in a different way from the way that you've imagined it. So being protective over your expertise and being confident that, like, no, actually it should be this way, and I've thought about this, and also I have the gravity and authority to be able to say this, I think is important. So not always undermining yourself as just an ingenue, as like a newcomer. And yeah, like especially for young architects, being confident enough to say like I've got this, and it's going to be okay. We should definitely do it this way. Yeah. I also wanted to say something about the drawing. So Julie, like you mentioned, like drawings, this like amazing skill that you develop over your 7 years of training, and it's such a rare skill amongst like the other professions. Like no other profession takes it quite so seriously as the architect does. And I think basically if we don't kind of protect that as like an ongoing culture, like a developing culture, then we will lose a massive thing of what architecture is about. And I feel like it's cyclically undermined by other bits of the profession. So I'm not kind of taking like random swipes here, but there's the sociological approach, or there's kind of building approach, or like concerns with policy. But this core tool that we have of drawing should be the main way that we inform those other areas of our concern as a discipline. Yeah.
So we've had quite a few questions and kind of comments coming in, so I'm going to just kind of whiz through some of those. It might seem like I'm jumping around, so if you've got a question in there, I will get to it, but there's been some come in privately to me and some publicly, so
I don't know how you're able to do both of that, Laura. Like, in all honesty, I'm completely ignoring the chat. Like, I'm just quite frankly not sharp enough to be talking, listening to Eddie and Julia, absorbing, looking at chat. So I'm just going to leave that with you and your genius.
So Dan has asked, as a current second year student, what would you recommend I or others in my position do / aspire to do for the profession and after uni? What should we aim to accomplish? What have you accomplished in your careers, and what did it take? So Zoe, do you want to start with this, because you didn't answer the last one anyway?
Oh my gosh, that is a massive question.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to. I mean, Dan, I think we can't possibly tell you what you should do. That'll come from you and from your own interests. I don't want to be kind of like dictatorial, but I suppose something that obviously given the context that we are in right now, you know, and what is happening, I think now it's becoming abundantly clear how important the design of space is, and the importance of designing homes and spaces where people are able to go out and to exercise and to be in the air and fresh air, and all of, you know, and the importance of hospital design and, you know, educational spaces that people can use, and, you know, how we use like spare spaces right now. Like, you know, I'm kind of find myself thinking quite a lot about all the dead space out there that is not, you know, it's not being used. And so how can we kind of go back out from this, you know, when we, you know, when we, as we kind of move through this challenging time, how we can make spaces super efficient and multi, and I mean that in a number of ways, you know, kind of multi-use, that, you know, we're not, construction is incredibly expensive. It's deeply unsustainable in many ways. Actually, sometimes, you know, the worst thing that you can do is build, you know, because it's you know, it's so unsustainable. So I'd kind of really like to encourage any students to be sort of thinking a bit more about how we are able to think about adapting, connecting up people with spaces, making the most of the spaces that we already have, through editing, alteration, adding to, altering, you know, adding to, rather than, like, I think there has certainly been an attitude, which I think has sort of dragged on a little bit too long, of you know, knock them down, build them new, and I think that, you know, that's really problematic. It's expensive, it's not sustainable. And I think, you know, thinking about people's needs actually at quite an everyday level is really, really important. And I think we're kind of experiencing this right now, that actually, you know, from here on, it should be completely illegal in any policy that any kind of homes are ever built within any outside space. Like, we're seeing this right now, like the need for people to have, you know, access to green spaces, to fresh air, to be able to go outside. So I think Dan, to kind of try and like answer your question, I think it's to get in, I would say it's sort of really be getting engaged with the social aspects of architecture, what architecture can do to improve and, you know, alleviate struggle in whatever small way. And that might be quite humble. I think right now, I was reading this morning, there was a piece in The Guardian which was by a clinical psychologist, who was saying that, you know, right now, actually, one of the things that I know I'm certainly struggling with is, I'll kind of think, oh, we're working on this, you know, nice project, we've got this little design going on, and then feeling like a sense of guilt of the kind of major issues that are out there right now in terms of, you know, healthcare, and, you know, how can we contribute towards those issues. I think actually architects do have a massive, I think there is a massive ability and a potential for us to be thinking about people's day-to-day lives and how we can alleviate struggle, even if that's actually at like quite a small local level. You know, it doesn't have to be about doing, like, you know, the massive skyscrapers of the sort of 1990s. Like, I think it's incredibly important that we move beyond that. Also, that as students kind of ask that, you know, students are pushing tutors in terms of like upping the level of community, social, sustainable, humanitarian, and I think it's really exciting when there's a kind of a dialogue between students. I certainly find with my students, when there's a dialogue about you know, being more conscientious, and, you know, students can kind of really lead the way in thinking about that in their projects, and challenging briefs, and thinking about empathy, kindness within society in terms of design.
Thanks. I'm going to get Julia to answer that as well, because I think you come at it from a kind of slightly different kind of type of practice or way of kind of researching and working. So maybe you can answer that. Oh, I think you're muted. Do you want to?
Sorry, yeah. I mean, echoing Zoe, I mean, I really don't think, I think the subtext there is almost kind of like you know, what's a good, you know, where is a good aspiration for someone? You know, what should you aspire to? And I really don't think it's for any of us to sort of say that to you. You know, we all have our own, you know, you should find that path for yourself. And then again, I think so. It's said it all. Well, I would just want to reinforce that I think we do have a kind of a moral imperative to think about the kind of politics of architecture, the sort of social effects of the way that we design, and not just the building, but I feel that there's often architects have become quite sort of pernicious with this kind of post-it note participation, which often legitimizes decisions on behalf of communities that are actually being made elsewhere. And I think, that these processes that can have really negative long-term effects need to be looked at. I've been looking at public space in a lot of London's new large-scale developments. All of these are designed by architects, and they actually reduced genuinely accessible public space to the residents in and around an area. So I think we need to hold power to account more, rather than to be complicit agents in sort of actors and processes which are detrimental to society.
Yeah, great. Eddie, did you want to add something? I mean, you're muted as well. I can't.
I'm back.
Right.
Yeah, I don't want to like too strongly disagree with what Zoe and Julie are saying, but I think there's an emphasis in what they're saying on the what, like what you should do, and not so much on the how you should do it. And thinking about the mechanisms, like where you can insert yourself in the process, is also really important, and how you might do that. Like using your skills as an architect, using your communicative skills, using, again, like drawing as a way of envisioning, like showing people what might happen, and also your analytical skills for really assessing what the situation is. Like in both a kind of physical sense and a like a soft processes sense, like a political sense. And I think that's sometimes lost in these discussions, where we talk in like quite high-minded ways about like moral imperatives, but not so much in like slightly dull mechanisms by which that happens. So I've been thinking about the closure of Victoria Park, which is just around the corner from where I live in East London. And like there's kind of one level of the conversation, which is like, this is an outrage, this is a scandal, this is a public good, like who agreed to this being taken away from us? But then when you take it down to the mechanism by which that happened, essentially it's like a really left-wing council being obliged by the police force to either resource the park better with resources they don't have, or close it. And so when you understand like that's the crunch point, that's the bottleneck, like number of people on the ground, then you can insert yourself there. You're like, oh well, we just need to arrange for there to be more stewards, and that's possible because those people got time on their hands. So that like being like morally outraged is like maybe a useful motor, but it doesn't talk about how to make the change. And I think architects can really involve themselves in that how bit better.
And just to sort of emphasize that, I mean, I've never actually worked for an architect. Oh, I did once for John McCaslin and Partners. Tutor. Anyway, I think there's in that how, I really like that point, Eddie. I also think that don't be afraid to not work for architecture firms. So I feel that, so engineering is quite close, but for me, that was the best architectural training I could get. But I even think now, I mean, I actually work for charities sometimes. I work for NGOs. So when I delivered a sanitation project, in theory, my client was an NGO. So don't, and I think, you know, Eddie, you brought up those practices like We Made That and Studio Weave, who all cut their teeth working for effectively the state. And so I think now could be a really, if you're struggling to find a job in an architecture practice, don't think that you failed if you end up working for a local authority, or even if you end up working at a food bank, because you'll learn something really important. And then if you can work in a food bank and use your drawings to maybe make that system better or to challenge it, then you're killing it. So I also think if you're not, which, you know, I hate to say it, but I'm worried about jobs for architects graduating, you know, when we come out of this. Don't be afraid, go working somewhere else, but just remember your skills and see if you can use them to change the terms of the debate of whichever profession you end up in.
I think I would echo, you know, what Julia says there is like, there is, you know, there's nothing wrong in working for an architect's practice, but there's also nothing wrong in working for other people. And those skills that you have as an architect coming out of kind of even part one are so useful to different professions and to different kind of means as well. So I think you can also, you know, think wider and what you can do and what you can kind of contribute. But I'm going to go back to some of these questions. One's coming from Amy, who's asking about architectural publications, and she's interested in how kind of those of us who've written for architectural publications got that experience, and was it accidental or an opportunity that we sought out, and how did we get there? I might just start with this one.
Oh, yeah, that's for you, isn't it, Laura?
Well, I think Eddie's written quite a lot, and there's other people in this audience. I see Shumi's face, and Shumi's been like nicely typing away kind of responses to people in that chat. Thanks. I feel like she could answer this as well. But yeah, so for me, I'd graduated from, well, I'd done my part 2, but at a fairly radical school of architecture, and I came out kind of thinking, oh, what am I doing? I was in a fairly standard practice, and I was kind of questioning what I was doing with my life. And I saw an internship come up at the AJ. And so for me, I just thought, oh, this is a kind of something different, a way out of practice. But it was at a time where internships weren't paid for. And I mean, I'll be quite honest in that. And I had no money. You know, I'm not a kind of rich kid who can afford to do an internship on no wages. So I convinced my practice at the time to let me move to London and do this internship whilst I still worked for them. So I was kind of going into the AJ in the day and like doing all this writing and doing stuff. And then I was kind of going home at night and working, filing drawings. And that's how I kind of paid my way as an intern. I did that for 4.5 months. And then I kind of had a retainer, so I had to go back to my practice. But the AJ knew it was a year long, so they called me up after a year and said, come back. And that's what I did. And then I was there for 6 years. But I think the thing for me was that the writing was a kind of a different thing to architecture. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do at the time, but I knew that I really loved architecture and I didn't want to like not be a part of architecture, but I kind of knew that practice wasn't quite what I wanted to do. And at that point I didn't know whether it was just the type of practice that I didn't want to be in. It was a fairly big, fairly kind of commercial. I mean, I think now I know that I'm more suited to kind of hands-on practice work. I mean, I do studio in the woods, I do like and I work with other practices who do kind of more hands-on work, and that's more interesting for me. But at the time I didn't know what I wanted to do. And the AJ was a kind of distraction to kind of help me work that out. But it also made me realize that there are other things that you can do while staying in architecture, but just being part of a discussion around architecture. And so I guess I don't know what my advice would be to anyone who wants to get into writing now, because it's such a different place to kind of when I started. I think, you know, there's not unpaid internships, and that's a good thing, but it also, like, you know, no one should really work for nothing. But at the same time, like, that was what I can't completely be like, no one should do them, because that's what gave me my opportunity, and I wouldn't be where I am now if I hadn't done an unpaid internship. And so I'm like,
so Laura, the way that I started writing for about architecture was not in the architectural press. I started working for Vice magazine because I was in a pub with some people who work for Vice, and they were talking about an edition of the magazine which was about like the future, and I kind of made a remark about how the future of architecture is being dominated by these octogenarians, like people like Norman Foster, like run the future of architecture. It's ridiculous. And at the time I was like 23 or 24, and I felt like my future was being stolen by older people. I mean, I think that actually is more true than ever. And yeah, so I pitched them a piece, and then I kept on writing for them. And after a while I did it pseudonymously because it got a bit complicated to write about architecture in other bits of like the world and try and be an architect at the same time. But yeah, I think the only other way, apart from getting like a internship, is just by like writing. You've got to write and you've got to pitch and you've got to do it a lot. And you've got to be okay with like not every pitch going down that well. But editors are looking for work. I think this is the thing that you need to remind yourself as a writer or an author. Like there is a demand for content, and like you got to fill the magazine. And if you have a good idea, then you'll get it in. And just not be scared to email editors. Like that's the only way I've ever done it. And after a while they contact you, which is really nice, really flattering. But actually most of the time it's you saying, how about this? This is an interesting thing. Here's an idea. And doing that like all the time.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So in terms of writing, I did used to, when I was a student, I wrote a blog variously so RIBA used to have like a student newsletter, and I started contributing towards that. I don't know if they do it anymore. And then also there was a call out when like BD Online again they had like a kind of open call for students to submit things, and I submitted some stuff to that. And then I remember there was a moment when I had submitted something and I didn't get a response, and then I submitted it again and didn't get a response. So I kept being like, well, why is no one, like I've done my piece, like why is no one responding? And I emailed the editor and he was like, unfortunately this blog that you've written is actually about an event that was put on by a competitor, and like so we therefore have an agreement where we don't write about one another's work. And I didn't, it was like as a part one, I didn't realize that, I hadn't realized that I'd written something that was never going to get published because of this agreement. Like we won't write anything that is about another organisation's exhibitions or something, and so I was really cross because no one had kind of taught me that, sort of given me that parameter. I wasn't to know, and so I stomped around and I was like, well, I'll just publish it myself, and it led me to setting up this zine which is called The Unpublishables, which was because I felt like what I had written was literally that, it was kind of unpublishable, like there was nowhere I could put it. And I spoke to a group of other friends and we kind of set up this fanzine. I think there's kind of quite a lot of examples of that, of like collectives writing, like setting up their own zines digitally, of course. That's now really, really doable. I think it's quite good place to practice and to writing your own musings, your own thought pieces, and just kind of having that rehearsal of getting stuff out there. And yeah, exactly as Eddie's saying, then when there's something that you think maybe you might sort of send off to other people, and just being quite persistent and not being too anxious if you get a no, then just put it on your own website or put it on Instagram, or keep kind of putting stuff out, and being quite productive. And I think as well, in the there are so many organisations right now who always that would always looking for people to volunteer their writing skills. For example, I'm a supporter of a charity called Contact the Elderly, and they're constantly looking for people who'll put together flyers or do little written pieces and things. And so anyone who's got writing skills, there's so many places where you can contribute that, and it doesn't necessarily, it gives you an opportunity to practice your writing, to refine your writing. It doesn't necessarily have to be writing about a shiny building. If you've got that skill, if you've got that interest in writing, I think there's loads of places where you can make that useful, and you can practice and you can rehearse, and you can kind of rehearse your ideas and make that helpful and constructive. I think then the flip side of that is also, if you're interested in writing, then doing a lot of reading as well at the same time, to get your hands on as many books as you can, to just read other people's ideas. It'll feed into your own writing as well, because reading and writing are two sides of a coin, right?
Yeah, I think that's what the advice that I would give to anyone is, just keep doing it. It's like architecture, you spend 7 years kind of just drawing and making models and drawing, and I think it's just keep doing that for writing, and you get better at it, and you send one piece off and one might get published, and you might have hundreds that don't, that you just kind of store up for a blog or something. I'm going to come back because we're getting quite a lot of questions in, so I'm going to come back to some of these. So Kate has just asked, as someone about to graduate and interested in interdisciplinary practice and not doing the same thing every day, I feel like this is a good question for all of you guys. It seems to me that every job ad and stable income opportunity is monodisciplinary. How do you go about practicing many things at once while earning a living? Is freelancing the only way of doing that? So who wants to answer that one? I feel like it's one that all of you can answer. So Eddie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. I don't know, because I think the only way I've really found doing that is either working for a very small practice that is interested in doing interdisciplinary stuff, or being freelance, which is what I do now. And I suppose well, there's one other like zoomed out way of thinking about this, like what does interdisciplinary mean? Like most architects are interdisciplinary. I think you have to be able to absorb quite a lot of information from disparate sources in order to like be a decent architect. And the only experience I have of working for like a big firm like Sauerbrück Hutton was actually really relaxing. It was really nice to have a whole infrastructure where like I never had to take out the bins. I never had to like think about like, you know, community consultation. I just like sat in front of a computer and clicked a mouse and I really, really lined those lines up. And it was fine. I often recommend my students just like go and do that for a while. It's good training, like earn some money. Not that that's necessarily possible in this like our current future, but it's not an awful thing to get that as a bedrock and then expand in different directions. Like it might be a bit dull, but like it's a good training. It's really relaxing. Like trying to constantly think about new ways of making money, being constantly propositional, like that's really draining. And doing that without any infrastructure is incredibly hard. So like caveat your desires, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Julia, do you want to add to that? Oh, you're muted again.
Sorry. Yeah, I think I put into the chat, I've always managed to work and always managed to make an income. I've never cross-subsidized my career. And so, and what I mean by that is that when I was working in the context of working in informal settlements in India, I wasn't doing another job to subsidize that. I was using, let's say, the academy to, and I've always described it like this, that the academy gives me my thinking time, which is actually quite hard to get funding for you to think about something. And then secured money through sort of development grants or like USAID, DFID, you know, there's these big organizations that actually do have plenty of money to develop projects, and thinking more locally, you know, I think that's not too, how I worked in India isn't too dissimilar from, let's say, how, well, and they've become very good at that, how we made that basically have their whole career subsidized by the GLA. So, and you know, just to kind of push that point about working for the public sector, I mean, I don't know how true that's going to be going forward, but I know all the architects who've gone into public practice, which if you don't know, you know, you can go and Google that. They all earn more money working for the public sector than they did in their previous jobs as architects. If, you know, if that's your thing and you're interested in working for a local authority, it doesn't necessarily mean, earning less money. For a lot of you, it might mean earning more money than you would do as a part one or part two in practice. And I think I wouldn't want everyone from my perspective to go away and to think, oh, I need to get a PhD scholarship to sustain this next stage, or I need to go and work in the academy. I think that's a way of doing it. And plenty of people do it. I also think that there's periods in your life. So when I was in my 20s, I think, you know, I had sources of money coming from different places, and at times it was really precarious. And I think now I am in a position of privilege where I'm salaried, and I also don't want to downplay that. It's a safety net that's so important. So, you know, echoing Eddie, go and work in a practice, and if you just learn how to file, do you have great file organization and get paid properly, and you can then have a family, and you know, all that is really good stuff. When I got Emerging Women Architect of the Year, it was also when I was personally at the worst stage of my life. I was having a horrendous time. You know, arguably when I was in my most successful period was when I was deeply unhappy and living out of a suitcase. So, you know, it's not, don't be too harsh on yourselves, particularly now going forward. And yeah, I keep on saying this, go and work for an NGO, go and work for, you know, go and like a kind of the public sector, or, I don't know, yeah, just don't turn away jobs that you think are not architectural, because everything's spatial. Yeah. Everything has spatial consequence.
I'd just like to quickly invite Lee Ibbott, who took part in our first of these, just respond to that as well, because you've written a comment in the chat, which I think is a really good response to that. So and it's nice to hear your voice, Lee. Do you want to add?
Laura, that is the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me.
I've been trying to avoid his voice.
Eddie tries to avoid my voice. I might do little recordings for you, Eddie, and then you can just choose when you need a little hit. What do you want me to say, Laura? Sorry.
Well, you would, in your comment in the chat, you were talking about kind of different forms of practice and things like that. And I think it just kind of really ties in with, you know, what we've just been discussing. So I thought,
yeah. I mean, I think I was saying in the comments a bit about, I mean, people think, right, if I can't get a job, then I'll try and create my own job. And that's really hard as well. I mean, sometimes I think it's worth creating your own client, you know, and there's traditional ways in which architects have done that by just, you know, ones who are lucky enough to either build their own house or kind of get a family member with a bit of money to subsidize something cool. But then other people take a different approach, and they kind of create maybe like an infrastructure. You set up a charity, set up a community interest company, set up a different kind of organizational infrastructure that then can kind of gather support, gather funding. And I think that, like Julia's saying, the model and the infrastructure within which you can choose to practice is actually really, really, really wide. I also worked for a charity for 3 years. I ran a small charity in the north of Glasgow, and that charity was also one that I actually kind of helped form and set up as well. And I just ended up, after doing that, thinking I might as well actually take it on and run it. And then I did that for a few years and realized I was shit at it, you know, up to the point at which it was then ready to be something else. It just needed someone with different expertise, and I wanted to do more designing and drawing and making and things like that. And now I get paid by a university most of my time. Previously, I've had my own practice. I write for magazines. And if you want to get involved in writing for magazines and things like that, then the best thing you can have is something interesting to say. So kind of, you know, observe the world around you, be angry about stuff, be interested in stuff, be inspired by stuff, and just articulate it. And at some point, someone's probably going to hear that and ask you to repeat it in a different forum. You'll kind of get there eventually.
Yeah, can I just quickly add on to Lee's thing? It's so important, because one of the things that I felt when I was young was I was like, I've got the energy and the enthusiasm for this, but why would anyone listen to me? And actually, when I worked for a charity, and similarly, when I started working for a charity, they were making candles with women's groups. And by the end of that kind of period of us working together, they were one of the best charities delivering community-led sanitation projects, because I helped them shift gears and change. But also they gave me 3 years for me to cut my teeth of what it feels like to work in a very different context. And so I think that's also, you know, sometimes you can get allies in very strange places that really bolster your what you know.
I think this isn't a response to any particular question, but just something that I feel like I'd be slightly disappointed if this conversation came to an end and I hadn't like plugged in at some point. That thing that what Julia just said, that word of allies, like I feel that right now in this period of isolation, you know, it's intensely important that we that we do strengthen our allies all the more, that we do reach out to our contacts, the people that we know, the people who we need to check in on, kind of also intersects with what Lee is saying at some level, like everyone's a client, everyone out there is an opportunity to make something happen, and that might not necessarily be like making a kind of a, I'd say like a project with like walls and windows, but to instigate things, and that an instigation comes about through talking to other people. Like you don't make stuff happen. Nothing really happens by just like sitting in a box on your own. Things happen and are strengthened through communality and sharing and exchanging ideas. And not only does there are chances that, like Julia was just saying, that you have the opportunity to learn from other people and to cut your teeth and to rehearse and to practice and to gain skills and gain knowledge. As Lee's saying, to find opportunities. You find other opportunities from people. And I certainly, it's something that I value immensely with the work of Part W in this collective that we've established, that actually, like part of the benefit, there's all sorts of things that like Part W is kind of working on at the moment, but actually sometimes just like a really, really good thing is that I've got like a group of incredible women working across the sector who I'm just like able to WhatsApp and say, at the end of the day, be like, are you guys okay? What's going on? Like, how are things? What people are working on, and that like dialogue, that conversation is amazingly enriching and rewarding. And you don't necessarily go into every conversation knowing what you're going to get out of it, but just keeping your networks bubbling, reaching out, getting in touch with people, having conversations, even if you don't know like exactly what you want the conversation to be about. You just kind of find people and make professional relationships. I think is absolutely invaluable. As a student, I think what chances are is that you probably, like, I think all of us can probably think of examples of conversation that started when we were students, maybe with a tutor, with another student, with someone who was like on a completely different course, a friend who's like studying geography, that like a couple of years later those threads start to, you pull on them, you kind of return to conversations and conversations grow. So I think like right now talking to people is just like a really good thing to be doing, like talking and listening and sharing, and out of that seedlings will come.
Could I add something to that, Zoe? That like a really good piece of advice that I was given once would understand the kind of cohort generational effect of networking, and essentially, like, there's no point walking up to the editor of the Architecture Review and saying, like, can you publish my thing? Like, talk to the people of your age who are doing that kind of role and try and like relate to them, because you'll all come up together. And so when you're like ready to write your like big 4-page spread, like they'll be editing something big.
Yeah.
And actually, like, it's your like cohort that are going to support you. Like it's great to have like connections with people who are more powerful, older, but actually, like, it's your contemporaries who are going to support you for the next 50 years.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that thing about like multi-generational, I mean, like for me personally, that's something that like is massively important to me within the work of Part W. We as a group, like when I founded the group, I consciously wanted to make sure that it was multi-generational. I'll have conversations with someone like exactly like you're saying, Eddie, with like Sarah Castle of IFDU and Fiona MacDonald of Fee and Matt, Alice Brownfield of Peter Barber, people who are like my generation. And then when there's like a question that we might want, there's something that we need to kind of bounce ideas off, we'll take that to someone like Sarah Wigglesworth. We're not going to waste Sarah Wigglesworth's time in like a WhatsApp group sharing images of like emojis of potatoes. But you have like those people there, and I think like learning, how to use those groups and how to reach across and how to be intersectional, intergenerational, and forming like so Black females in architecture, there was this really lovely phrase that they used of like forming your coven. forming your team, you know, your squad. I think that's a really, really lovely phrase of like the idea of like, you know, making your group and then reaching out from that group and enlarging it is, you know, super valuable.
I think Sarah Wiggles might like a potato emoji.
Do you know what? I actually think Sarah Wigglesworth would probably like love a picture of a potato, but I'm too scared. Like, no matter how close we are, not yet. Maybe.
Also, I don't know how long this is going to last, but I wanted to like pick up on another strand that Zaha was talking about earlier about the moral imperative not to always propose new buildings. I've been getting more and more interested recently in like the creative potential of not just restoration but also demolition. Like what can we do creatively as architects to get ourselves into these other bits of the industry? Like no one interests themselves. Like Rota a little bit. Rota have got a unit at the RCA who are doing some kind of cool stuff, but no one really interests themselves in general in like the potential for that, and so the potential for like demolition and like reclamation. So if there's a bunch of like fresh-faced young like part 2s, part 1s on this call, I want to recommend to them that they look into that as an area of the like expansion for this discipline.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that's going to be another topic that we focus on kind of later down the line of these. We've had a few kind of requests for topics on kind of sustainability and different more technical sides going forward, but also I think there's a huge kind of cultural idea in kind of the reuse of buildings that we can discuss. I'm going to kind of draw it to a close now, just because I know that we could kind of go on forever, but it's also been like an hour and a half, and I know people have got lives.
Got biscuits to go and eat.
He's got a Tesco delivery to go. So yeah, I've got my delivery coming at 6, so I've got to be out of here. So I just wanted to thank all of our kind of speakers who've got involved today, and also like Lee and Shumi and everyone else who's got involved with like adding comments and questions. I think this has been a really great kind of discussion. I'm going to continue to do these going forward. There's been talk that it's Easter next week. Who knows? I don't know. So might not do one, but might do. Not decided yet. Don't know what holiday is. But yeah, so if you've got ideas for kind of future topics or things that you want discussed, you all have my email, so fire them at me, or you tweet them or whatever. And I was going to say something else. Oh yeah, someone asked about putting the recordings online. I'm going to be working in the kind of next few weeks to try and sort out my website and add these on, so that you can kind of look back at previous ones if you haven't been to them or missed them. And you should check out the links. Shumi's put a great piece from AD in the kind of chat. Yeah, so that's it for this week. Thanks for everyone for kind of taking part and for coming and listening to my ramblings. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Bye.
Thanks, Laura. Eddie, and so it's really great to Zoom meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you too.
And
Let's
everyone
do this more
else.
often.
Yeah. Everyone else, thanks for joining. It's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.